Okay, in this screencast, we're going to talk more about the law of demand and what causes demand curves to change. But just as a refresher, let's talk about the law of demand and how to interpret these charts. So for starters, on this particular demand curve, please notice that this graph has some things that are always going to be constant, whether we're talking about demand or talking about supply. And the first thing is that quantity will always be on the horizontal axis and price will always be on the vertical axis. And in this particular demand curve, we can interpret this chart as the following. So at price 1 or P1, the quantity demanded would be Q1. And at price 2, the quantity demanded is Q2. And at price 3, the quantity demanded would be Q3. So the way that you can choose to interpret this chart is that, as it says over here on the left, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded will be, which is why our demand curves are downward sloping. So if you think about that, as prices increase, people tend to buy less of a particular product. And so that's considered an inverse relationship. Another thing you should know about demand curves and supply curves is that there is a particular thing that, for whatever reason, economists love to differentiate, and that is the following, is that when there's a change in price, that affects the quantity demanded only. And that's key, that's why it's underlined. And so therefore you're going to see a slide along the curve. And so what do I mean by a slide? So just take a look at the chart here over on the right-hand side. You're going to see purple dots show up. And those purple dots are meant to represent the slide along the curve. So that can happen with demand curves, and with the yellow dots, you will notice the slide happening along supply curves. So if ever asked if there's a change in price, that affects the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied. So to clarify something that we're going to be talking about a little bit is the fact that I will talk about slides and I will talk about shifts, and you should really understand the difference between the two. So on the left-hand slide, you see something that is called a slide. So yes, I know that was repetitive, but this chart here shows you that. So on the previous, I mentioned this idea about those purple dots and how anything along that demand curve is a representation of what happens when there's a price change. And so when price changes, you slide along the curve. What you will see next is the idea that if something is shifting a curve, then you're going to see that you're going to have an original demand curve, and then you're going to see a completely new demand curve. And if that happens, then that's going to be referred to as a shift in the curve. And curves can shift, so they can shift to the right and they can shift the other direction, which hasn't been drawn, but they can also shift to the left, and I'll explain more about that. So I think this chart does a pretty decent job at explaining the shifts in demand curves. And so if you take the middle line here as your starting point, then you can interpret it as follows. So you can say that if it moves in the direction to the right, then that means there's going to be an increase in demand. And so we will call that a shift in the demand curve to the right. So that's how you would interpret the right-hand shift. Now, if, once again, starting in the middle, if you see a reduction in demand, then you would have a shift in the demand curve to the left. And the way that I like to remind myself what it means is that if it's left, meaning if it moves to the left, then left is less. So that means that there's a reduction in something. So for the rest of this presentation, you will learn more about the shifts in demand, and those are called determinants of demand. And there's a mnemonic that I will walk you through, which is called prices. So Prices, as you see on the screen, and each one of those letters will represent one way that demand curves can shift. So the first one, the first P in prices, it stands for preference of tastes. So what that means is that if an item were to become popular or a fad, or people in general in the economy have a higher demand for a product, then the demand would increase. And so over here on the right hand side, there's a drawing of an increase due to a increase in, say, this particular example here. If you see an increase in that particular product, it would then shift to the right. The R in prices stands for related goods, or in other words, complementary goods. And the example that I have for you here is if you think about hamburger and hamburger buns. And if you see, for instance, let's take hamburger, that if you see a decrease in the price of hamburgers or the ground beef, then that is going to lead to an increase in the demand for hamburger buns, because that's a related good. So in other words, they're complements to one another. So if the price of one product goes down and it's related, then presumably the demand for the other product would actually go up. The next is income, and that's the I. So income of buyers, and this says that if your income goes down, if it decreases, then your overall demand would also decrease. So once again, if this was the current demand, then if you know, let's say you've lost your job, then you have less money to spend. Therefore, your overall demand for goods and services in the marketplace would then go down. The C stands for consumers, the number of buyers, and this says that if the population, for instance, goes up, then the demand in general in the marketplace would also increase. So once again, this would be your current demand curve, and then to demonstrate an increase in demand, the demand curve would shift. E stands for expectations of buyers. If you expect prices to rise in the future, then your current demand will increase now. And that can be, for instance, with airlines. The airlines tend to raise prices around peak holiday seasons, but they do offer some fares that go on sale occasionally. If they can figure out how to get you to buy your ticket now, then they can better predict their plane load in the future. So they will sometimes have sales, and so by taking advantage of the price today, you are in a sense hoping that you're not going to have to pay a higher price later. So sort of that expectations that happens. The last letter S is substitutes. And I want you to imagine Coke versus Pepsi, and let's imagine that both of these sodas are equivalent in your mind. And so if the price for a substitute were to decrease, then the demand for that item, the other item would actually decrease. So for instance, if Coke and Pepsi are generally the same price, but if the price of Pepsi goes down this week, then the demand for Coke would also go down, because as the price becomes cheaper for Pepsi, people would choose to buy Pepsi that week. For this practice, I'm going to ask you to, on a sheet of paper, just jot down some examples of, for instance, number 1, create a list of substitutes for the following items, and then create a list of complementary goods for each of the following items. And just go ahead and hit pause on this screencast and take a moment and jot down some different examples that you can come up with. Now there's lots of different options and lots of different answers here, but for instance, here are a few things that maybe you could have written down. For wallpaper, a substitute for wallpaper could be paint. For grapefruits, a substitute could be oranges. A belt, a substitute could be suspenders. For a chess set, a substitute could be checkers. For carpet, a substitute could be hardwood floors. So in other words, things that you could, in a sense, easily switch out for one thing or another. As for complementary goods, you want to be thinking about things that would go with the particular item, so related. So for a ping pong table, you could have said things like paddles or ping pong balls. For an aquarium, you could have said fish, rocks, fish food. For a cup, you could have said a beverage of, whether it's soda or milk or juice. For a bed, you could have said sheets or pillows. And for tennis shoes, you might have said shoelaces or perhaps even tennis rackets. So for the last part of this screencast, I've got 5 different practice problems, and each one of them asks you to consider the scenario and to say which determinant of demand is represented, and then whether or not there's an overall increase or an overall decrease in demand. So for this particular practice problem, it's what would happen to the demand of pizza if you found out pizza causes heart disease? So on your same sheet of paper that you just were using, jot down what you think the determinant of demand is, and then what you think whether or not it's an increase or decrease in demand. Hit pause, and then when you're ready to find out the answer, go ahead and hit play again. So the answer to this first practice problem, you should have said that there was a preference of taste, or maybe you said expectations of buyers. Either one of those would have been correct, but the overall demand would have gone down due to this particular scenario. So let's move on to the second practice problem. This practice problem is the following. What would happen to the demand of Nike shoes if it's the favorite shoe of many sports celebrities? Once again, tell me which determinant of demand, and is there an increase or decrease in demand? So go ahead and hit pause and then hit play when you're ready for the answer. For this determinant, you should have said preference of tastes, and that there would be an increase in demand because of the celebrity status tends to motivate people to want to also be like them as well. So here's for problem 3. A new energy drink comes to market that does not have negative side effects. So for instance, like jitters or crashes. So which determinant of demand does this apply to, and is there an increase or decrease in demand specifically for the product Red Bull? So hit pause and then play when you're ready for the answer. So this new energy drink would be considered a substitute, and we would see a decrease in demand for the product of Red Bull. Practice problem number 4. Here's the scenario. Student allowances and the minimum wage for work increases. What's the determinant? And is there an increase or decrease in the demand of video games? Hit pause and then play when you're ready for the answer. This determinant is income of buyers went up, and so we'll see an increase in demand of video games. And the last problem is this one. If the price of razors goes up, what happens to the demand for razor blades? What's the determinant, and is there an increase or decrease in demand for razor blades? Hit pause and hit play when you're ready to find the answer for this last practice problem. The determinant in this practice problem is that it's a related good, or maybe you said complementary good, and that there's going to be a decrease in demand for razor blades. So that concludes this particular screencast on determinants of demand. And remember the mnemonic prices.